Hello and welcome to my Maven Lightning lesson. For those who just joined, there was a Zoom link challenge, and I'm assuming you all got the updated Zoom link. All right. Given that, I'm going to give a little bit of time to allow others to join. In the chat, if you want to just indicate where you're calling in from. I'm based here in the Pacific Northwest, just outside Seattle. Lived here for roughly 8 years. All right. So my Maven talk today is titled Go to Market, the Psychology of Demand. And we're going to be studying both the psychology of demand from a lens of B2C versus B2B, as well as how do you leverage jobs to be done research methods to inform uncovering what I call switching behavior, which is the idea that for switching behavior to occur, for people to buy new products or services or hire new products and services, what are the different motivational forces at work? And based upon our study of that, how might we rethink some of our go-to-market strategy, positioning, and messaging? So do me a favor. I'm going to be introducing jobs to be done research methods, specifically oriented around this idea of what we call a switching. But give me an indication of what your current experience is with jobs to be done research methods. Have you done jobs to be done research yourself? Have you participated in a project where it was leveraged? Have you simply just read about it? Is the term new to you? Or do you have experience in using jobs to be done research? And then secondly, for those who have applied jobs to be done research, give me an indication of in what manner have you applied jobs to be done research. So sometimes jobs to be done research is leveraged to inform innovation strategies. Sometimes it's leveraged to inform how we market or message products, what I call language market fit. Sometimes it's focused on simply determining or deciding what we build and for whom we build it. All right. Some of you may have seen a talk I gave last week, which is around this idea of jobs to be done research oriented around progress versus process. Job theory being the core to both methods, but each method having a slightly different angle of attack in terms of what we're studying. Jobs to be done as process is oftentimes focused or oriented around defining what we build and for whom we build it. So leveraging both an analysis of jobs through opportunity scoring and classification of jobs, as well as using jobs to figure out and orient different targeted audiences or segments in regards to who we build for and what we build. Jobs to be done as progress, which we're going to be focusing on today, is really oriented around the study of buyer journeys and why people switch. So why people hire a new product or service, in the process fire an old product or service, and what different forces are at play promoting progress or blocking progress during those buyer journeys. This particular method helps us go beyond what we typically would study. We typically, when we study customers, are very focused on understanding wants and or unmet needs, which makes sense, right? We're in the process of designing and building offerings to a targeted user base. And we want to understand what is the underlying problem? What are they trying to do that they're not able to do? How might we fill those gaps in unmet needs? And so informing what we design and build. But quite often, if we simply have that lens of simply understanding unmet needs, we don't necessarily build an understanding of the hiring moments itself, right? And so beyond what we design and build, as we begin to launch, create that MVP, bring that product to market, at the end of the day, what leads people to switch? What forces are involved? what motivations are involved, what forces are promoting progress, what focuses are blocking progress. And so we're going to be studying that aspect of leveraging jobs to be done to inform the study of buying journeys and the switching behavior within them as a lens to informing our go-to-market strategies. There's a myth that B2C and B2B decisions are different in their nature, right? That B2B decisions are rational, or that demand for solutions in the B2B space is rational, whereas B2C related decisions are more emotional. And when you study customer progress or buying journeys and what we're calling switching behavior, you come to the realization that really all demand is emotional in its origin. And whether in a B2C and or B2B context, the rationalization is often used post-purchase as the justification for the decision rather than being the true drivers. In a B2C context, the stakeholder group involved in the decision is oftentimes just an individual. It might be a pair of people, right? A couple, and or it might be a household, a family. So the stakeholder group in B2C is typically more limited in terms of 1, 2, 3 to 5 people involved in a given decision. Whereas in B2B more often than not involves multiple stakeholders. And we're going to talk through how we think about or classify the different stakeholder groups. But those stakeholder groups, depending upon the type of organization we're selling into, can range from 4 to 6 people to 6 to 10 people to 12 to 15. Those decisions oftentimes involve much greater risk, given the type of thing we're selling, the level of investment to be made, and oftentimes have much broader organizational considerations in regards to those decisions being made. If you participated in any of my talks previously, one of the core principles of jobs to be done is this idea of a struggling moment. And the concept of a struggling moment is this idea that there's a point in time where individuals or enterprises reach a conclusion that what they're currently doing is no longer working, that there has to be a better way. And so when we study customer progress, we're studying, first and foremost, what are those struggling moments? Because those struggling moments often differ by our targeted audiences. And even though they all, in effect, buy the same product or service, the reasons or the motivations for why they buy or why demand originally formed are due to unique and different struggling moments. So we're not going to dive into this particular topic in a lot of detail, but just kind of want to make that as a reference point. And also this idea that it's important when we study struggling moments is that we can differentiate between the degree to which they're a weak struggle or a strong struggle. And so oftentimes we'll study unmet needs, we'll design and build products, and there's no uptake in those products. And it's fundamentally because we either thought there was a struggling moment and there wasn't, or the struggling moment we're solving for isn't significant enough for people to make change. Everyone tries to avoid change. Individuals, enterprises, we're all change avoiders. And so understanding struggling moments is a really critical starting point to the study of customer progress. And what I want to identify here specifically is this notion that the struggling moments can relate to time, money, risk, operational challenges. But what's really core and what we really want to focus on is struggling moments in relation to identity. And so as we kind of dive into this idea of the psychology of demand, we're going to really hone in on this notion of identity, both as individuals and or businesses. So when you study demand psychology through a B2C lens, at a high level, you can narrow it to these 4 core dimensions. One being oriented around identity. And this is the recognition that in B2C, when we hire products, we oftentimes hire products through this lens of who we want to become, that there's some transformation or change in our life as a result of the product. The product or service is a means to an end. We're hiring the product to achieve some new set of outcomes. One set of those outcomes being in relation to identity. And so the reasons we hire Peloton, Patagonia, Rolex often have an identity-oriented context in terms of who we want to become and or who potentially we want to be perceived as in the broader community. Another core dimension is around this notion of emotional relief. So we're hiring to help overcome a struggling moment, a pain or an issue in relation to our daily lives. We're oftentimes hiring in relation to some form of social signaling, how we're perceived, how we're treated. We're oriented around fitting in or standing out or getting status. And typically as consumers, we tend to prioritize short-term outcomes over long-term outcomes. So 4 core center points for demand psychology from a B2C perspective, both I would constitute as this idea of pulling us forward, right? And so you see the tagging of these being more around desired outcomes or aspects of the product that pull us, that the product being offered, that there's a set of things about the product itself that are appealing to us, pulling us towards a new way of doing things. When we think about demand psychology from a B2B standpoint, it's actually quite different. One is this context of that B2B decisions involve organizations, and the problems typically are more organizational and individual. But the risks are individual, right? The people making the decisions, there's an individual context of the risk associated with a given decision. And so whereas B2C decisions are oriented around transforming us in terms of who we want to become, B2B decisions are often more cautious or more conservative in that we make them to the degree that hiring that product or service comes with limited or reasonable risk, that it doesn't affect, in a way, who we already are. At minimum, it doesn't affect our current position. And so dimensions of that relate to career risk in making this decision or pushing this decision. Is there any career risk associated with that decision? Political capital. Will my political capital increase, decrease, remain neutral as part of this decision? To what degree does this decision help inform organizational progress? If we're missing targets, we start to make targets. If our costs are too high, then we start to reduce the cost. If our customers are churning, then we have greater retention. So directly associated with the operational outcomes or OKRs that we've established for our organization, as well as fear of inaction. At some point for B2B decisions to be made, the cost of doing nothing has to be greater than the cost of doing something, right? There's greater risk in not making a decision. And so that fear of inaction can oftentimes drive us to make those decisions. So you can see that the dimensions for each of these are different, B2C versus B. So what I want to do is kind of help to visualize this or make it more tangible. And we're going to dive into an actual jobs to be done research study that I did in relation to B2B. So we're going to take a B2B specific case study. And it's oriented around the decision to bring agentic AI technology into my organization. So there's a product vendor who's promoting and selling a solution around agentic AI. We're going to be looking at how we evaluate or better understand this B2B buying psychology through the lens of jobs to be done research. So one of the models we use in jobs to be done research is this idea of there being promoting forces and blocking forces. So promoting forces, things that are driving change, are pushes, struggles of the current situation, pulls, something that attracts us to a newer, better way of doing things, desires, the degree to which we think the thing we hire can help us achieve a set of outcomes we haven't been able to achieve historically. But also that there are forces blocking change or that serve as resistance. Status quo in most B2B decisions, I think the stat is as high as 55 or 60%. That status quo wins. People set out to study different products or offerings, and at the end of the day, they choose the status quo to just stay where they're at because the risks associated with changing or converting seem too high or might impact their operations. That there are anxieties. To what degree is what the vendor is promising really true? So we often are concerned that the marketing differs from the product itself. And we've all made prior decisions in our lives. And so evaluating and assessing prior decisions leads to things we want to avoid in the future. We want to avoid that the introductory product offering doesn't serve our needs and that we actually have to upgrade in order to truly serve our needs. Or we want to avoid having an ongoing subscription and would prefer a one-time cost. Or the cost of converting or integrating is much higher than I thought it would be, or the change management associated with implementing it is more difficult than perceived. So these 6 forces are at play in any B2B decision. And for switching behavior to occur, the forces on the left have to outweigh the forces on the right. If you have strong allegiance to current ways of doing things, that status quo bias is always going to outweigh potentially the advantages or the pulls of switching. All right. And when we study these forces, the best way to study these 6 different forces and desires is to do them through a buyer journey or a timeline lens, which is the idea of how do we study how people go from first thought or struggling moment, this idea that the current way of doing things is no longer working, to the hiring or firing moment. So these types of interviews always involve existing customers or competitors' customers, because that hiring moment has to have occurred, right? That someone has gone through this cycle from struggling moment to hiring moment in completion. And when we run this type of interview, we're studying that journey. And we're studying it across these different stages. Passively looking being this idea of that we're problem aware, but we're more observing. We're not deep into research or evaluation or comparing and contrasting. We're really just understanding the marketplace, what's out there, the different offerings, and so forth. And then actively looking where much greater time and energies are being placed towards making this decision. In a B2B context, we've formed a buying committee, or we've already communicated to the executive team that we'll reach a decision in the next 6 weeks. And so we're now really drilling in and studying and evaluating. We've issued some form of RFP or RFI to inform our activities and so forth. To then deciding where we've done our homework, we've done our research, we've narrowed down our decision set to 3 or 4 potential ways of moving forward. We understand our criteria. Now we're ready to make the buying decision at this point in time. What's key to note that is there's this idea of a triggering event. And the idea of a triggering event is that something has to occur internally or externally that transitions us across stages. There's something that occurs that transitions us from passively looking to actively looking, from actively looking to deciding. It could be an internal event, could be losing a strategic customer. It could be a competitive threat from someone in our marketplace. So there could be any type of trigger event, either kind of push or pull events that lead us to transition through the buying process. So when we're studying the journey, we're studying this timeline, and then we're studying the forces and desires along the way. Now, what complicates things from a B2B standpoint is this notion that while there's switching behavior, the enterprise needs to make a decision in terms of whether to hire or fire a product. That in a way, there are actually 4 different switching decisions being made. And so if you if you were to characterize the buying group in the study we studied mid-market. And so typically in a mid-market situation, there are anywhere from 4 to 8 stakeholders involved in a B2B decision. But for larger enterprise, it could be 6 to 12 or even more in a large enterprise decision. But you can typically categorize those 4, 6, 8, 12 people to these 4 different buyer types. One we call a champion or a coach, someone who's driving it internally. They see benefit to being the one to lead the charge. And they may serve as a coach for you as a selling entity in terms of you partnering with them can help them champion or initiate the change that they seek to have in their organization. And that individual may have been appointed internally or may just have been taking up the charge themselves. They're typically the person that's switched first. They're the ones that are already, they want to move. They want to decide, they want to take a certain path. There's user buyers. So these are the people that will directly be end users of the product or service that you're offering. They're very focused on near term, right? They really want to ensure that day one, the value of this change is delivered and understood, that their day-to-day gets better rather than worse in adopting a product or service offering. There's the economic buyer, or the decider. Unique to the economic buyer, they're the individual that must say yes. Others might not say yes and be overvoted by others in the buying group. The economic buyer must say yes. But they're individually invested in the decision to the degree it affects them individually because they're the name on the decision going forward. And then there's the technical buyer. The technical buyer typically involves some aspect of procurement and or IT. They're typically only sold to the degree that you can address all of their concerns and issues, bringing that product or service into their organization. And they're often the ones that will switch last. So in structuring these interviews, the way we went about this, we did this through a synthetic user research effort. And so we had a targeted market. Our targeted market in terms of firmographics was studying mid-market buyers, 10 to 1,000 employees, ARR of 1 million to 100 million. And we wanted to study roles across industries, across functions, right? Because the solution we were selling, Agentic, could affect marketing, sales, product, customer success, and so forth. And then individuals across these different buyer types. So we were interviewing founders, CEOs, heads of product, heads of operations, CTOs, etc. Purpose of the study being to study the buying journey from struggling moment to hiring moment, and to get a view into these 6 forces and desires for each of the targeted buyer types we were interviewing. So 12 synthetic interviews, and I characterize synthetic interviews as being archetypes. When you do traditional one-to-one interviews, you're interviewing an individual, a person. When you do synthetic research, you're studying populations. So one interview can represent people in that same archetype, which can represent hundreds or thousands of people that have similar business contexts, similar decision contexts, and so forth. And then the purpose of the study was really to inform an understanding of these different forces and desires across each of our buyer types. So recognizing that each buyer type is going to have different motivations, different questions that need to be answered, different desired outcomes for making a higher decision, and so forth. And so characterizing those in terms of the forces and desires driving change, the forces and desires resisting change. And as you can see here, the context of the user buyer really is from the standpoint of individual impact, right? Will my day get better or worse? So their forces, whether they be push or pull, whether they be status quo bias, anxieties and avoidances, are all oriented around the impact to them as an individual in their daily work, how they work with colleagues and so forth. Whereas the economic buyer's decision criteria is really all oriented around, is the bet they're making worth it? More of the long-term impact of the decision, how it relates to progress within the organization, how it relates to their own political capital within the organization, to what degree is there added career risk in making this decision and so forth. So you start to uncover very unique and different forces across each buyer type. Any questions in terms of this idea of these 6 forces and desires? Rajan, you had a question around synthetic users. How do we know they're not hallucinating when providing answers? One is what platform you use. The platform I use for doing synthetic user research is one, it's multimodal. So it doesn't rely on a single LLM. My personal take is that the hallucination is very exaggerated in terms of the degree to which it affects synthetic user research. I've been using synthetic user research for almost a year now. And what I find is that there's several dimensions about synthetic that in certain instances make it better than even one-to-one interviews. And that oftentimes in one-to-one interviews, people hold back what they would say from product reviews, in conversations, in interviews, in reports and studies. And so one of the benefits of synthetic research is you're bringing in perspectives, ideas, decision-making analysis from a much broader set of contexts, from LinkedIn to social media posts to product reviews and so forth. And so there's actually a great benefit in doing synthetic research. Predominantly, I work with a lot of startups and founders. And in the startup world, you're less interested in what an individual thinks and more in what a group of people think, right? Because you're trying to find a big enough market to drive your overall business success. So good question. I'm sure different people fall on different spectrums of that. Any follow on to that, Rajan, or other questions relating to synthetic user research? Have you tried it or performed it in any way?
Yeah, I've done it, but when you try to share results with others, other people generally say, hey, oh, but those are my response. Have you talked to real users?
Yeah, and that's a valid question. When I'm working with founders, they're doing it in parallel with customer discovery calls. And they'll test the synthetic research in the customer discovery calls. So they'll literally take a finding from the synthetic research and they'll be sitting in front of a VP of sales and they'll say, we talked to another VP of sales 2 weeks ago. And they're literally referring to the synthetic research. And they said they had this challenge. Do you share that challenge? And they're finding the synthetic research to be proven out through the discovery calls, each reinforcing each other, and or at minimum being a great conversational starter because they come across as a little bit more of a peer or someone who has a broader understanding of the domain they're building product for. Oftentimes founders haven't even worked in the industries they're building product for. And so the synthetic research is like a really quick startup to understanding domains and problem areas and people solve. But I could see that. I could see that challenge.
Yeah, thank you.
Dominique, my understanding is that it has to be an acute moment, whether I thought previously that when things pile up and a tipping point emerges, things change. Am I correct? Yeah. So there's this idea of it. There's got to be something that initiates the demand. You can think of demand as having inertia, right? So back to that point of that measuring the struggling moment, if it's an insignificant moment, there's no momentum. So it's got to be significant enough to lead people to want to go about solving things because there's time and effort involved in evaluating, selecting, piloting, testing, solutions, and so forth. And so the problem's got to be big enough, or the perceived outcome of solving it's got to be big enough for people to put in that time and effort. So it's definitely in a moment in time for sure, but those triggering moments imply that the pushes and pull forces, which are often the triggering events, are often what leads you to transition. So a pull event could have been a particular demo that you saw, kind of like, oh, this will really solve our problem. Let's put more time and energies into figuring out how to get that in place and so forth. So I would define the tipping point to me as the hiring moment, because you'll interview individuals or organizations, and that timeline for reaching a decision might be weeks, might be months, might be years. And you do always want to uncover what was happening at the time they made the hiring decision, because that context is important to understand, because that is the tipping point. Why 15th on a Friday why did you make the decision now? You've been evaluating this for months or years. Why did you make it now? I get at where your question is coming from or something else you're getting at. All right. Walton, I'm a CEO who is directly responsible for revenue generation. All right. So how do you process or think about this idea of the buyer journey and switching behavior? Does it resonate? Do you see these different dimensions in the conversations you have with prospective customers or clients?
I think can you hear me?
Yeah.
I think your summary is insanely on target. Just literally speaks to me because I've been in emerging technology acceleration now for 26 years. And all of the interpersonal aspects associated with what you've nailed down are completely on target. The trouble that I've experienced over the last couple of years in particular is a lack of attention span because there's too many things being presented
Yeah.
and presented in a way that sounds almost too good to be true and therefore has lost the buyer trust in the messaging. And frankly, I don't know how to overcome that. I think you've nailed the problem. I don't really know how to rifle shot through the solution of that issue. And so that's what my feeling is.
Gotcha. So one aspect of that is more often than not, at least in the primary community that I work with, is founders and B2B. More often than not, when we sit down with a prospective customer, we talk about the product. The reason for the call to occur was that the customer reached out to learn about our product, or we want to get feedback on the product. Are we designing and building the right things for the right people? And the conversation isn't around progress. It isn't around what are you trying to solve for? Why haven't you been able to solve for that to date? What's prevented you from making progress towards those goals and objectives? What are the outcomes you're trying to achieve? This particular type of research is more oriented around the buyer journey from a progress lens rather than a feature level discussion.
You feel like it'd be more effective to pose those questions prior to a call and therefore be able to be more efficient and targeted in your presentation once you get in front of them as opposed, because I think a lot of times if you react to them actually disclosing something that isn't perfect, that it will seem like you're just trying to fit to their shape of what they want to solve.
Yeah, very much a combination of desk research a problem of analyzing prior calls, synthetic research, another option. Like if your call with a customer, if you're asking so many questions that they feel like, why am I educating you on my business? Right.
Mhm.
That's a negative thing, right? Shouldn't you have studied my business? Shouldn't you have come prepared? So you have to balance that, right? Making it like a discovery call context of learning. You don't want to use the discovery call to learn what their industry is about, but you do want to understand what's most critical to them.
Normally, I know like their second cousin's name before I get on the phone call with them, but that doesn't necessarily seem to transfer beyond the call. A lot of times I can impact and persuade the audience, but it doesn't carry forward within an enterprise and get conveyed to the next level and to the next level and to the next level. And these are just challenges that are always going to be in existence. But
Yeah, so that's back to this recognition that there are buyer roles, right? And so you don't necessarily get access to all of these. You might get an RFP that clearly communicates what the technical buyer is asking for without ever sitting down with them. Your point of entry might be an economic buyer, but you might not have access to the user buyer. So the idea of studying the buyer types is once you understand who you believe is going to drive the change internally, that in studying each buyer type, you can as well inform them as what it's going to take to push the agenda forward. When you go
yeah,
to your economic buyer is going to want to know this. How can I help you be prepared for that conversation? Or would you like me to sit down with you? Like, that's how I use this. Like
so
you at
you
all.
so could you hypothetically create a brief that addresses all four of these categories and a follow-up email
Yeah,
to that whichever one of the three or four you've actually dealt with?
exactly.
I love that idea.
And that's why if you know the forces, like the forces all are about speaking their language because it's not product language, right? It's problem progress language. And it's what they're concerned about and why they may or may not reach a decision. So yeah, so that's the idea that there's a buying community, which could be one coach, 4 user buyers, 1 economic buyer, and 2 technical buyers. It's just how do you study what it's going to take to
I
get them
guess
all?
what I'm deriving from this is you could create what I'd call a proactive battle card
Yeah, love that
that
idea.
that basically already addresses a lot of those verticals as part of the follow-up document.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. I don't want to take up everybody's time.
Any other questions around the forces and desires model? Alicia, do you have some additional questions around the concept of synthetic user research?
I'm just curious how you embed this in the overall process and then how it's received. I think someone mentioned earlier, sometimes management are like, oh, we're the actual users. So I'm just curious about that.
Yeah. So partly because I use a platform to do it called Synthetic Users. And one thing I like about the platform is that it designs research studies like a traditional study. You define a targeted audience. And so in this particular study, I mentioned mid-market companies, I specified industries, I specified stage of growth, I specified specific roles. So it knows a target audience. I articulated a research goal, which helped us with myself and the platform collectively form basically the interview guide. And then we executed the survey, and different from like prompting an LLM, when you prompt an LLM, it's like question, answer, right? Is that this type of research gives you basically an interview transcript, and then you analyze the transcripts to understand these different forces. I never asked, what's the push? There's never a direct question relating to these forces. They were all indirect questions to, through the transcript, uncover what their anxiety was or what they were trying to avoid, those kind of things. I do one-on-one interviews for clients. I also do AI moderated interviews, another method of interviewing where the AI just facilitates the interview, but it's with real people. But there's just such a time and cost benefit to doing synthetic research that I'm a big proponent. But not of itself. You use, my clients were doing customer discovery calls and this same.
Okay. Okay. Good. Does help. Thank you.
All right. Okay. So this is, play along as you wish. So if this were, think enterprise agentic AI technology, right? There's a user buyer view. There's an economic buyer view. Let's see the degree to which kind of you understand this framework. If there's a technical buyer, IT or procurement, like what do you think some of their forces might be? Either push, pull, anxiety, avoidance. Any thoughts? Walt, you might have some thoughts around this in terms of things you come across. Productivity, good one.
I would add that the times that have been most successful, I've found that I have to go higher in the organization first, even though it's a much trickier funnel to get through.
Yeah.
To find the dynamic individual who's in that role for a reason, as opposed to the mid-level who's simply trying to not lose their job.
Yeah.
And methodologies for finding a champion usually are going to have higher odds, in my opinion, in upper level management where people are progressive and aspirational.
Yeah.
That's my view. It's not answering your question, but that's just my experience. Technical buyers tend to be following down the line of after you've been vetted.
Definitely a gatekeeper. And that's why on that spectrum of first to be ready and last to be ready, they typically are a little bit on the last to be ready. But you can waste a lot of time and energies getting to that point where there's no way this is going to fly, given that's the technical buyer. So there is some benefit to having a view into the technical buyer's criteria.
It's imperative for pre-qualification.
Yeah.
Yeah. But so as far as outreach goes, initial outreach, I've found that it's better to try to aspire to go higher.
I would definitely agree. Definitely agree. All right. So we've talked about the type of research. We're trying to study these 4 different buyer types. We're trying to understand how these different forces and desires impact their ability to make a decision, where the forces for driving change much overcome the resistance to change. But all this it's not for research sake alone. It's really to inform how you go to market, be it your overall strategy, be it your specific positioning, whether that positioning is in relation to the competitor space, whether that positioning is specific value narratives for different audiences, or a very buyer-specific framing, whether that framing is oriented around the desires and the pulls, or overcoming their anxieties and avoidances. So positive versus negative framing. And then your actual messaging. So I've worked with clients where once you have the research, you take all of the different touch points, inbound, outbound, right? And now you can reflect on how does this research inform changes to our outbound and inbound work and so forth, from website landing pages to emails to LinkedIn posts to whatever, because you now have a framing for all of your content pieces in terms of identifying who are we speaking to, what strategy are we taking in relation to our messaging, and so how do we now tailor each of those different activities, knowing what we've uncovered around the buyer journey and so forth. So that's where it's most powerful, is translating the knowledge of what you've learned to what are we going to do differently in our next discovery call? Or what are we going to focus on when we do a demo of the product? To what are our follow-up emails going to be like post doing the demos and so forth? You're just thinking through all those touch points through these lenses of, at the end of the day, for them to make a hiring decision, these things are going to be important for them to answer. All right. So that's the talk today. Maven, if you haven't heard, has recently created this idea of running workshops versus courses. Courses being multi-day events, workshops being single-day events. So I have an upcoming workshop on July 8th, really just focusing on teaching people how to do these job to be done switch interviews. And so a set of exercises that we'll be putting you into as individuals and paired up with others to run through the activity and frame and conduct an actual switching interview in a paired process, to learn how to kind of prep and plan for them, how to do them, and then how to synthesize the outcomes from. All right. Any questions about that? Any questions about jobs to be done research in general and or this particular upcoming workshop?
I'd just like to say thank you for your very concise and informative presentation today.
Thank you. Dominic, Julian, Tori, before we wrap up. All right. Thanks for the feedback. Do share with others. And thank you again for just being part of the Maven community. Have a great day.